Ramphal Centre have already extended gracious and eloquent welcome to us all. As chairman of the commission, I would wish to say how pleased we are, how delighted we are, and how suitable it is that we meet here in Rhodes House as we prepare our final report on the movement of people in the Commonwealth. We would like to thank, as a commission, the warden of Rhodes House for making these facilities available to us, and certainly for the words and thoughts which he shared with us as we opened our meeting this morning. Just over a year and a half ago, we met as a commission to embark on the first task which the Ramphal Centre is undertaking. A centre named in honor of a most distinguished Secretary General of the Commonwealth to promote matters of interest to the family of nations to which we belong. We chose as our first topic, or perhaps it was chosen for us by the trustees of the Centre, migration and development. And the more we have pursued our endeavors, the more we become convinced of its importance to a group which came into being centuries ago and based on the movement of people. In some cases by force, and in other cases voluntarily. We think that this is an issue which, like climate change, deserves attention at every level. In fact, we are of the view that it has taken us too long to recognize the centrality of migration and its impact on economic development and social mobility. We're doing this at a time when the Commonwealth itself is seeking to identify its role in the 21st century. With the profound changes that have taken place in international relationships and in economic fortunes. We are particularly delighted that on this special occasion, Lord Howell of Guildford is here with us. We know of his constant and unflagging interest in matters pertaining to the Commonwealth, and we hope to be able to hear from him and share some thoughts with him. But before I call on him, there's a representative of the Trustee, Board of Trustees, who has been singular in his contribution, not just to the Ramphal Centre, but to this particular occasion. And without attempting to make any announcements which would be inappropriate for one of my standing, we have every reason to believe that in the not too distant future he will be called upon to play some central role in the deliberations of those who represent the family of Commonwealth nations here in the center of the Commonwealth. Dr. Nonis has a very interesting history, particularly in a university. When one is called a doctor, one is not sure if there's a medical problem, whether his services can be engaged or not. He is one who is highly qualified in the medical profession. I think he has taken some time off to take charge of something which is associated with Sri Lanka, tea. And having got that on a good competitive footing, he is now ready to take on additional endeavors. I have great pleasure in calling on him as a representative of the trustees to share briefly some ideas with us. And without any further intervention on my part, he will be followed by the Right Honourable Lord Howell of Guildford. And then we'll be able to have an exchange as befits a family when they meet, infrequently as we have the opportunity of doing. So, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Honourable P.J. Patterson, Lord Howell of Guildford, Minister of State of Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Honourable P.J. Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honourable George Vassalou, former President of Cyprus, trustees of the Ramphal Centre, High Commissioners, Commissioners of the Ramphal Commission, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to say a few words here today, and it's a particular privilege in my capacity as a trustee of the Ramphal Centre. First, I'd like to congratulate the Ramphal Commission and its trustees for commissioning all these studies and organising this conference, which particularly in the context that the Commonwealth is one of the largest arenas for migration, and I gather has over 45 million international migrants within the Commonwealth of Nations. I think have a particular affinity for this subject because I think I myself am a somewhat complex migratory product, having been in 2 Commonwealth countries on 2 occasions. I was actually born here, then spent my early childhood in Sri Lanka, then came back and spent 28 years in London, and then went back to Sri Lanka and spent the last 7 years here, and now I'm being sent back to London again. So I think I speak from that very practical vantage point. So I could even be a suitable guinea pig for the Ramphal Centre's next study. And I thought what I'd like to do is simply share just a few thoughts that have occurred to me during my time between these two countries, as a member of what I saw of the diaspora community, and as a member and as a migrant to both countries. I think, irrespective of the aphorism one uses, whether one calls Sri Lanka a pearl within the string of pearls of China, or whether one calls it the teardrop of India, I think Sri Lanka has always been geographically directly in between the maritime routes of the East and the West. And I think that's partly why Sri Lanka today is so multi-ethnic, culturally diverse, and has such heterogeneous communities within it. If I look at my own experience of Sri Lanka, well, I think Sri Lanka today, after 28 years of protracted conflict with the terrorists, has now achieved peace. And the people of all races in Sri Lanka are free. They're free of the hegemony and autocracy of terrorism. And finally, I think we now have a historical opportunity to actually make that transition from developing to developed nation status. But I think if we are to do that, it will require the mobilization of all resources, particularly those of the indigenous as well as the migrant communities. And that is particularly relevant in the context of what Ramphal Centre is doing within Commonwealth nations. I think it's an opportune moment for the UK, with whom we have tremendous affinity, to actually join Sri Lanka in this whole post-conflict rehabilitation process, reconciliation and reintegration process. And I think the UK, as out of interest, being the head of the Commonwealth, has probably the greatest reservoir of goodwill of any country with Sri Lanka. And now we've got an opportunity to build on it. Both our countries have very rich and varied plurality of economic, cultural and linguistic traditions. And I think we should draw more deeply on this strength of our shared heritage, and we can also leverage on our commonalities and build the economic base of a unitary Sri Lanka. I don't profess to know very much about migration, but I think if one looks at migration theories, whether one looks at the neoclassical economic theory, or whether one looks at the dual labour market theory, or the relative deprivation theory, or even Ravenstein's theory, which it all mentions the importance of bridging, before people migrate, bridging even within their country, the urban-rural divide. Because that has been oft quoted as one of the reasons why people then see the need to then migrate subsequently. And this has been clearly articulated also in the Mahinda Chinthana, which was actually the President of Sri Lanka's overall vision for the country, which provides for a pro-pearl growth, a growth with equity, and a growth aimed at bridging the urban-rural divide of Sri Lanka. And indeed, the national plan specifically focuses on the development of of areas which are now free in the north and east, under Vadakkin Vasantham, which is flourishing north, and Naganhira Navodaya, which is the eastern revival. If you look at Sri Lanka today, post-conflict, 2 years on, we've now got a macroeconomic environment very conducive to economic growth. We've got a GDP growth rate of over 8%, quarter by quarter. We've got single-digit inflation, single-digit interest rates, increased our reserves, the rupee is appreciating, and we've narrowed our fiscal deficit. And I think in a situation like this, it would be enormously useful to then harness and leverage the diaspora, which would actually then go about investing in, for example, diaspora bonds, which have been floated recently, so that they themselves can play a substantial part in the country they left behind. So I think these are the sort of examples which are specifically targeted at socio-economic development of the North and East post-conflict. The imperative, I think, is for us all to transform the diaspora from being agents of division to being agents of development in a constructive manner, which will be both contemporary and relevant to the needs of the people in Sri Lanka. And as Amartya Sen described, we are always, as he described, we are evolving a framework of mutual respect and understanding. And as we in Sri Lanka, as we formulate a pragmatic strategy for healing relationships, I think one must first develop a more greater understanding of the complex demographics of Sri Lanka itself, which actually traverses the misconceptions of this very monolithic Tamil Sinhalese cultural identity. There's frequently, I think, in migration, a dichotomy or disjuncture between the aspirations and hopes of a diasporic migrant community and the ideals and aspirations of the indigenous community they're left behind. And I think it's partly because migration brings that sense of social dislocation when people migrate. And when they try and assimilate in the new country, they sometimes face economic deprivation, exclusion, social isolation in their search for this assimilation. And I think it then translates into a new construct of self-consciousness and an assertion of their identity. If this goes to an extreme, and if they fail then to truly integrate and assimilate in the host country, they can develop oppositional cultural and political identities. Oppositional and cultural identities can harm and can actually lead to polarization of views, which can become resistant to change, and misconceptions can ensue, and their views then of their country of origin take two paths. They can either be terribly romanticized or they can be demonized. I certainly experienced this dichotomy having been in Sri Lanka for a few years. When I returned back, I realized how wrong I was in my impression of the country that I'd left behind, simply because I lived in a different country and assimilated the views that surrounded me. And I found this even with my fellow colleagues of all nationalities, that we were fundamentally very different in our thought process. And partly it's the result of the environment that you move through. And I think that brings us to the issue of the conflict itself. I think in Sri Lanka it's often been incorrectly viewed as a stark binary dispute between two culturally and linguistically polarized communities, which is actually not the case. If one really examines the demography of the civilian population on the ground, one sees that actually the majority of the different ethnicities in Sri Lanka live perfectly harmoniously, majority in the south of Sri Lanka, in a heterogeneous community. The concept of a monolithic identity is actually factually incorrect. And I think one needs to understand this misconception, because it is only then that we all will actually appreciate the tremendous reservoir of goodwill that exists between all our communities, between all ethnicities in Sri Lanka. And it is only then that we will have the opportunity to heal the tremendous wounds of conflict and all work together to rebuild our nation in the post-conflict era. Not only our state, but actually rebuild the nation, which is made up of its people. The compelling imperative, therefore, I think, is to move beyond misconceptions and evolve a framework of migration as an instrument of development, not of division, to harness migrant communities, to benefit both countries of origin and the country of destination. And I think that with a pragmatic and positive approach of engagement, education, reconciliation, reintegration, and economic development, I think all members of the diaspora abroad now will have opportunities to work with the communities they've left behind. And in that way, that is what the process that we're engaged on at the moment, to foster diaspora involvement in development, capacity building, and technology transfer. Also to facilitate the ongoing non-sectarian and non-parochial education, which will serve to expand the reach of understanding and reason, especially youth educational programs. Because it's at this age that the mind is most open to inquiry and debate. And I also think we need to harness the value of technology. And participation and promotion of English is a tremendously powerful tool in developing countries such as Sri Lanka, and also IT literacy. It may surprise you to know that even the London Stock Exchange is actually now run by software developed in Sri Lanka, and which was purchased, the entire company was purchased last year. And for example, next week, His Excellency John Rankin, the new High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, the new British High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, and myself, we will both be going to the Hill Country to open a new English and IT literacy centre to serve underserved youth within the plantation community. I think those are the sort of initiatives one needs to look at. The other is sport. I think sport has always been a unifier across ethnic divides. Sri Lanka has bid to, it's actually submitted a bid for the Commonwealth Games of 2018. But what is interesting is that if it were to win the bid, it would really serve to develop and actually address this issue of the urban-rural divide, because they've decided to actually host it in Hambantota, and it was really serve to develop a regional economy. Cricket, of course, as you all know, is always a great unifier. Almost always. But judging by the sound thrashing that our Sri Lankan team received from England a couple of days ago at Trent Bridge, I'm not sure I should even begin to broach that subject today. Of course, England on the day was a substantial, far better team. So I think that I don't want to go on for much longer, just simply to share these thoughts with you, thoughts that I've had over the years. And I think it's in this spirit of mutual respect, of diversity and understanding, that all of us in Sri Lanka are working together. Tamils, Sinhalese, Muslims and Burghers, and all religions, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu and Muslim, as we together join and build a pluralistic and cohesive nation. We also enjoy, as I said, a warm and long-standing bilateral relationship with the UK. And I think if one looks objectively and dispassionately at the post-conflict scenario in Sri Lanka, it is clearly changing for the better. What the Sri Lankan people need and what they want is to be given in the best Commonwealth spirit, to be given the graciousness of heart and generosity of spirit and an open mind and the time, so that all our communities have both the opportunity, the space and the time to rebuild our nation. I wish you all success in your deliberations, and thank you.